The fog that night had the texture of damp velvet, smothering every lamp along the Strand, until even the carriages seemed to glide through dream rather than air. I remember it well, for it was the last time I ever saw the great detective at the height of his powers, before the curtain fell on the final performance that none of us knew was being played. Holmes stood by the window of our Baker Street rooms, his lean figure half dissolved in the smoke curling from his pipe, the glint of the street gas light touching the sharp angles of his face. His silence was a living thing. Outside, London murmured its endless riddle, wheels over cobblestone, distant laughter, the ghostly cry of the newspaper boys shouting headlines about a missing actress whose beauty had once commanded half the empire. I was writing idle notes in my journal when he finally spoke, his tone grave but controlled. "Watson, does it strike you as curious," he said, "that a woman who lived her life upon the stage should vanish so completely when the lights went out?" It began, as always, with a question, and by dawn we would be caught in a web spun from theatre curtains, deceit and blood. But I could not know then that this case would draw from Holmes not only the full extent of his reason, but also something he had long buried, his human heart. If you wish to walk beside us through that fog again, to see the mind of Holmes at its sharpest and his heart at its most exposed, then stay with us. Subscribe, share this chronicle, and join me as we reopen the case I swore never to tell, until now. It was one of those evenings in late November when London seems to close in upon itself, its fog not a passing weather but a living thing, soft, persistent, and all-consuming. The lamps along Baker Street glimmered faintly through the mist, like embers dying behind gauze, and the slow, rhythmic clip of horses' hooves on the cobbles sounded strangely muted, as if the air itself were weary. Within our rooms at 221B, the fire burned low, casting long, unsteady shadows upon the bookshelves and the familiar clutter of chemical apparatus, violins, revolvers, and the latest newspapers whose crumpled pages bore the fingerprints of my companion. Sherlock Holmes stood before the hearth, one hand pressed to his chin, the other balancing his pipe as he gazed down at a small parcel lying unopened upon the table. He had been silent for nearly half an hour, and I knew better than to interrupt that curious stillness that always preceded his bursts of deduction. From outside came the sound of a carriage halting, then retreating into the distance, leaving only the sigh of the fog against the window. Finally, Holmes stirred, his lean figure outlined against the dim glow of the fire. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the name of Miss Evangeline Ormond?" I turned from my chair, puzzled. The actress, the one who performed at the Lyceum last season. A remarkable voice, if memory serves. "The same," he replied, "though her name shall not grace any further playbills, it seems. She vanished 3 nights ago, shortly before her farewell performance. Scotland Yard attributes it to caprice, a theatrical whim. Lestrade, however, is unconvinced. He sent this parcel an hour past." Holmes indicated the brown paper bundle, its twine frayed and faintly stained. "It was discovered in her dressing room?" He untied it with surgical precision, revealing a small silver locket, its hinge broken clean through, and a folded playbill marked with a blot of dark red ink. Holmes held both beneath the lamplight, his face impassive but his eyes burning with that cold blue intensity which, once fixed upon an object, seemed to extract every hidden truth. "The ink," he murmured, "is not ink at all." He raised the paper to his nose and inhaled lightly. "Blood, of course, though not recent. It has aged by at least 48 hours. I leaned closer. The playbill was from the Lyceum's latest production, The Duchess of Death, a melodrama of revenge and betrayal that had enthralled the fashionable set. Across the top, in graceful script, was Miss Ormond's name, followed by the curious line, "The final curtain shall fall for all." "A strange motto," I said, "if it is indeed her handwriting." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, observe the stroke of the F. too heavy for a lady's hand. No, this was added later with deliberate menace. He turned the locket over, revealing a miniature portrait within, a young woman of surpassing beauty, her features delicate, eyes luminous yet shadowed, as though she carried some unspoken sorrow. A single strand of dark hair was looped within the frame. "Evangeline Ormond," Holmes murmured, "admired by half of London, envied by the other half. Tell me, does that expression strike you as theatrical or genuine?" "It is difficult to say," I replied. "There is something haunting in it, too still for vanity, perhaps too resigned for innocence." Holmes nodded slightly. "Precisely. It is the stillness of one who has performed a role too long and no longer remembers where truth ends and art begins." He moved to his desk and retrieved a telegram, its paper crumpled from repeated handling. "This arrived yesterday," he said. "Unsigned, but bearing the postmark of Bow Street. It reads simply, 'When the Duchess dies, so too shall her reflection.' A riddle, perhaps, but one with a blade concealed behind its poetry." As he spoke, the distant sound of carriage wheels approached once more, stopping abruptly outside. A sharp rap echoed through the stairwell, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she called. "Says it's a matter of urgency." The visitor entered before we could reply. A tall, angular man in evening dress, his hair slicked back and gloved hands trembling as he removed his hat. His complexion bore the pallor of sleepless nights and guilty conscience. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice tight. Holmes inclined his head. "You're expected, sir. Pray take a seat. You come from the Lyceum, I presume." The man's eyes widened. How could you know that?" "The faint scent of grease paint upon your cuff, the single strand of horsehair from a stage wig clinging to your lapel, and the dusting of rouge at your collar. All trifles, perhaps, but trifles make the sum of a case." The visitor stared in astonishment, then sank into the chair opposite. "I am Henry Vale, stage manager to the Lyceum Theatre. Miss Ormond's disappearance has thrown the company into chaos. The police came and went, asking questions, but they understand nothing of our world. You must help us, Mr. Holmes. The theatre is dying under rumor and scandal." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Tell me precisely what occurred on the night she vanished." Vale clasped his hands together, his voice unsteady. "It was the dress rehearsal for her farewell performance. She arrived late, unusual for her, and seemed distracted. During the final act, she faltered in her lines, something she had never done before. When the curtain fell, she retired to her dressing room, saying she needed a moment alone. No one saw her leave. The door was locked from within. We broke it open an hour later, and she was gone. Only that cursed locket and playbill remained." Holmes rose, pacing slowly before the hearth. "Locked from within, you say, and no secondary exit?" "None, sir. Only the window, but it opens onto a sheer drop into the alley." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "An impossible disappearance, then. Those are the only kind worth pursuing." He crossed to the mantel where his violin rested and drew the bow lightly across the strings, producing a single low note that lingered in the air like a question unanswered. "Tell me, Mr. Vale, was there anyone among the company who bore Miss Ormond ill will?" The manager hesitated. "Actors are a jealous breed, Mr. Holmes. She had rivals, of course. But there was one in particular, Lord Alistair Pennington, her patron. A man of influence, accustomed to possession. They quarrelled often. He was seen leaving the theatre that evening in great agitation." Holmes's eyes flashed. "And yet the yard chases phantoms while the true motive sits in a box seat. Watson, we must pay a visit to the Lyceum at once. There is something in that locked room that refuses to be silent." The carriage ride through the fog felt more dream than journey. The gas lamps passed like spectral eyes, and the chill crept through my coat as Holmes sat opposite, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes distant. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the stage is the perfect crime scene. Illusion is its currency. A disappearance upon the boards is not tragedy, it is applause. We arrived at the theatre near Saint-Eustatius, midnight. The building loomed above the square, its grand facade dimmed by soot and shadow. Within, the vast auditorium lay silent, the velvet curtains drawn, the scent of dust and perfume mingling in the air like memory. Holmes moved through the aisles with the precision of a surgeon. His lantern beam swept across rows of empty seats until it found the door marked Miss Ormond, private. Inside, the room was a shrine of absence. Rouge pots, silk gloves, faded flowers, all the ghosts of performance preserved in disarray. Holmes knelt before the dressing table, inspecting the floorboards with his magnifying lens. "No struggle," he muttered. "No sign of haste, only the faintest imprint of a boot heel, small, narrow, likely female, but not hers. She was taller. And this—" He brushed his fingers along the mirror's frame, revealing a smear of carmine pigment. Stage paint mixed with wax. Used in disguises. Someone was preparing a new face. I felt a chill run through me. "You think she disguised herself?" Holmes did not answer. He stared into the cracked mirror, his reflection fractured into many. "Perhaps Watson?" he said at last. "Or perhaps someone else wore her reflection instead." The wind outside moaned through the shutters, and the gaslight flickered, casting the shadow of Holmes's profile across the wall like a silhouette upon a curtain. In that moment, it struck me that the case had already crossed the threshold from logic into theatre, and we were no longer the audience, but players upon its stage. "Come," Holmes said quietly. "The play has only begun." He turned down the lantern, leaving the room in near darkness, save for the faint shimmer of fog at the window. Somewhere deep within the theatre, a door creaked open of its own accord. Holmes smiled faintly, as though at a well-timed cue. "The curtain rises," he murmured. The following evening found us once more in the labyrinthine depths of the Lyceum Theatre. By day, it was a marvel of gilt and velvet, its chandeliers and painted ceilings the pride of London society. But by night, stripped of its laughter, its applause, its illusion, it transformed into something altogether different. A tomb for forgotten voices, filled with the scent of dust, cold stone, and candle wax. Holmes had secured permission from the theatre's proprietors to examine the premises at our leisure. Yet even with the stage lights extinguished and the house empty, I could not rid myself of the feeling that unseen eyes were watching from the wings. Holmes moved ahead, his lantern cutting thin slashes of light across the darkness. "You perceive, Watson," he whispered, "how every theatre, no matter how grand, conceals two worlds, the one the audience adores and the one it must never see. It is in the shadows, not the spotlight, that truth resides." He gestured toward the trap-door mechanism at center stage, where carpenters had rigged the machinery for the play's climactic scene. "Here," he murmured, "is where Miss Ormond's character was meant to fall to her death. A false drop, ingenious in construction and fatal only to those ignorant of its secrets." The floorboards creaked as we approached. I crouched beside the opening and peered down into the dim underbelly of the stage, a narrow crawl space lined with ropes, pulleys, and discarded props. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere unseen. "You believe she may have escaped through this?" I asked. "Escaped, or been removed," Holmes replied. He knelt, examining the rim of the trap-door with his lens. "Note the faint abrasion along this hinge, as though from a glove edged with metal wire. A woman's glove, perhaps, but not a delicate one. Our prima donna had help, or an accomplice." A faint noise broke the silence, the slow, deliberate tap of a cane against the floorboards. Holmes extinguished his lantern in an instant, motioning for silence. The sound drew nearer, echoing through the gallery above us. Then, a figure emerged in the dim light of the proscenium arch. tall, draped in a black opera cloak, and crowned with a wide-brimmed hat that concealed all but the glint of pale eyes beneath. He moved like a shadow learning to walk, each step precise, theatrical, controlled. The man paused at center stage and turned his head slightly toward our hiding place, as though listening to a private melody. From the folds of his cloak, he withdrew a white glove and let it fall to the floor. Then, without a word, he descended through the trapdoor mechanism itself, vanishing into the dark void below. I drew a sharp breath. Good heavens, Holmes, did you see? He was already in motion, leaping forward with feline grace, lantern rekindled in an instant. Quickly, Watson, he knows these corridors better than we. We descended into the understage passage, where the air grew colder and the smell of damp rope and rust filled our lungs. The tunnels branched endlessly, some leading to the dressing rooms, others to the stagehands' quarters or the old storage cellars from decades past. Our footsteps echoed like drumbeats in an unseen orchestra. Once I thought I heard laughter, low, hollow, and distant. Holmes pressed forward, every nerve sharpened to a hunter's precision. "Observe," he murmured, kneeling to inspect the ground. A smear of grease paint mixed with candle soot. He brushed against the wall here. He moved swiftly, but not invisibly. We reached a narrow stair spiraling upward toward the orchestra pit. As we ascended, the faint outline of a door came into view, half concealed by a hanging curtain. Holmes pushed it open, revealing a small chamber lined with old costumes and discarded props, mannequins in faded finery, a cracked mirror, and a rack of masks whose hollow eyes gleamed eerily in our lamplight. Upon the mirror's surface, written in rouge, were the words, "The Duchess bows to no man." Holmes's reflection stared back at him like a ghost from another world. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are not dealing with a disappearance. We are dealing with a performance extended beyond its curtain call." Before I could reply, a door at the far end creaked open. The cloaked man stood framed in its threshold, half silhouette, half nightmare. His face remained obscured, but I caught the glint of something metallic. A mask, perhaps, or a disguise. Holmes stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. "Sir," he said, "you have chosen a dangerous stage upon which to play your part. Identify yourself." The figure's voice, when it came, was low and measured, each syllable pronounced with the care of an actor before an unseen crowd. "There are no men or women here, Mr. Holmes, only roles. The one you seek has already shed hers." Holmes's tone hardened. "You refer to Miss Ormond." "She was never Miss Ormond," the voice replied. "She was an invention. Mine." And before we could move, he turned, sweeping through the doorway and vanishing once again into the darkness. Holmes darted forward, but when we reached the alley beyond the stage door, the fog swallowed everything. Only the faint rustle of silk remained, as though the night itself had worn a cloak. For several moments we stood in silence. Holmes crouched beside a puddle, his lantern beam revealing the edge of a white glove half submerged in the water. He lifted it carefully. On the inner lining, stitched in red thread, were the initials E.O. "She left it willingly," he said, his voice distant. "A breadcrumb for those clever enough to follow." "Then she's alive?" I asked. He did not answer at once. "Alive, perhaps, but the question is, under whose authorship?" We returned to Baker Street near dawn, both wearied and haunted by what we had witnessed. Holmes paced the room like a caged spirit, his mind aflame with speculation. A masked figure speaking in riddles, a vanished actress who may not exist, a theater drenched in artifice. "Watson, do you not perceive the symmetry? We are chasing a ghost who knows we are watching." I tried to sound rational, but the man's claim, surely he was mad. Madness and genius differ only in the degree of applause they receive. Holmes replied sharply. "Whoever he is, he knows the stagecraft of misdirection better than any I've met. He plays his role for us deliberately." He turned toward the fire, holding the glove to the light. "See here, the fabric is imported. French from the atelier of Gaston Valette, costumier to the Paris Opera. And this perfume," he inhaled slightly, "jasmine mixed with opium resin. A signature scent used only in one place along the Thames. Limehouse. Then that must be our next destination." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "and I suspect the third act of our unfolding drama." He paused, then smiled faintly, almost with admiration. "Our adversary, Watson, is an artist. Every gesture is calculated, every allusion rehearsed. He or she invites us not merely to solve a crime, but to understand it as though we were critics at a play. The question is not how the prima donna vanished, but why the audience was meant to believe she did." He sat at the table, pen poised above his notebook, and wrote a single line before closing it again. "When the performance ends, the true curtain rises." Outside, the city stirred awake, the bells of St. Martin's in the Fields tolling 6. The fog began to thin, though not enough to dispel the chill that lingered in my mind. As I gazed at Holmes, silhouetted against the window, his features half lit by the fire, I felt the strange certainty that we had stepped not merely into another case, but into a story already written long ago by unseen hands. The glove lay upon the mantel, drying by the firelight, its pale fabric gleaming faintly, as if waiting for its owner to return. "Watson," Holmes said softly, almost to himself, "the theatre is not the only place where men wear masks." The fog over the Thames had thickened by the time we reached Limehouse that night, swirling in slow, spectral coils above the water. The lamps along the dockside burned low, their light distorted through the haze, and the smell of coal smoke mingled with the sharper tang of salt and fish oil. London was asleep, but Limehouse never truly slept. Its alleys whispered with the murmur of sailors, the clatter of crates, and the occasional distant cry that was never answered. It was a place where the river carried secrets as easily as ships, and where the respectable dared not linger. Holmes walked ahead, his stride brisk and unflinching, the brim of his hat cutting through the mist like the prow of a ship. I followed close behind, clutching my coat against the damp. "You believe the trail leads here?" I asked. He gave a brief nod. The glove's fabric was French, the perfume unmistakably Oriental. Both converge in this quarter. Limehouse is the crossroads where East meets West, and where disguises are bought as easily as tobacco. We passed beneath a weathered sign reading Chow Lin's Emporium of Curiosities, its windows glowing faintly. Within, I could make out shelves cluttered with porcelain, jade, and lacquered masks that gleamed like ghost faces. Holmes paused, studying the shop's entrance with clinical detachment. "Note the faint mark above the door frame," he murmured. "A symbol drawn in cinnabar paint. Chinese, denoting mirror. Curious, is it not, given our actress's obsession with reflection?" He entered without hesitation. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, its flame trembling. Behind the counter stood a man of indeterminate age, his expression unreadable, his hands folded within his sleeves. Holmes greeted him in slow, deliberate tones, exchanging a few words in what I presumed was Cantonese, language being one of the detective's many silent accomplishments. The man regarded him with wary curiosity before disappearing into a back room, returning moments later with a sealed envelope. "For you," he said simply, his English tinged with rhythm, but clear. "Left this morning by a lady in grey. Said the tall one would come." Holmes accepted the envelope with a curt bow. Its surface bore no address, only a faint scent of jasmine and the trace of a crimson fingerprint near the seal. He broke it open, drawing forth a single sheet of paper written in violet ink. The handwriting was elegant, yet uneven, as though composed in haste. "Mr. Holmes, you must not seek me. The truth you pursue is heavier than justice and will not endure the light. The stage was only ever a veil. Behind it lies a confession not meant to be spoken. When the river turns black at dawn, look to the house with the crimson shutters. There the mirror cracks. Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully. "The lady in grey," he murmured. "Watson, we are no longer hunters. We are being led." I could not suppress a shiver. "You think this is a trap?" He smiled faintly. "Every case worth pursuing is." We left the shop and made our way toward the river's edge. The fog had grown denser still, and from the dark expanse of water rose the slow groan of a passing barge. As the letter instructed, we followed the narrow quay until, at last, a faint splash of color emerged through the mist. A derelict townhouse with shutters painted the color of dried blood. Its windows were black, its door ajar. Holmes motioned for silence and drew his revolver. We entered cautiously. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and decay. Broken furniture lay strewn across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, the faint drip of water echoed like a clock marking the seconds. Holmes's lantern beam swept across the walls, illuminating a dozen framed playbills. They were all from the same production, The Duchess of Death, but each bore a different date and, more disturbingly, a different face where Miss Ormond's should have been. Each likeness was eerily similar, yet subtly altered, as though the same woman had lived a dozen lives under a dozen names. "Good Lord," I whispered. "What does it mean?" Holmes approached the nearest portrait. "It means, my dear Watson, that Miss Evangeline Ormond was no mere actress. She was an identity worn by many, a creation, perhaps by the same impresario who vanishes behind masks and cloaks." He brushed his fingers along the frame. "Note the recurring detail. The silver locket. It appears in every portrait, unchanged. The constant amidst illusion." Before I could respond, a faint creak sounded from the floor above. Holmes gestured for me to remain still, then ascended the staircase, every step deliberate. I followed, revolver drawn, my heart thudding like a drum. The corridor above was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper. From behind a half-open door spilled a pale glow, the flicker of a single candle. Holmes entered first. The room was small, scarcely furnished, save for a dressing table upon which rested a cracked mirror and a half-burnt candle. Before it sat a woman in a grey cloak, her back to us, her posture perfectly still. "Miss Ormond," Holmes said quietly. The woman turned. Her face was pale, her eyes large and dark, and for an instant I believed we had found her, but then the illusion shattered. The skin at her jaw bore the faint line of stage wax, and beneath it, another face entirely, harsh and unfamiliar. She rose slowly. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice trembling between defiance and fear. "He won't forgive this." "Who?" Holmes asked. "The man you saw in the cloak," she whispered. "He calls himself the director. We all obeyed him once. He found us, trained us, gave us names, faces, and stories to wear. Evangeline Ormond was his masterpiece, a fiction made flesh. But she grew tired of being his creation. She tried to leave. That was her crime." Holmes studied her with piercing calm. "And you are?" I was her understudy. Her gaze flickered to the mirror. "He made me become her when she vanished. Said the show must go on." The wind outside howled through the cracks, making the candle flicker wildly. "Where is he now?" Holmes demanded. The woman's lips parted, but before she could speak, a sound shattered the silence, the sharp crack of a pistol from somewhere below. The mirror behind her splintered, shards cascading across the floor. Holmes lunged forward, pulling her aside as we ducked behind the wall. "Watson, down the stairs!" he shouted. I obeyed, revolver ready. The front door swung violently in the wind, and through the shifting fog I glimpsed a shadow fleeing toward the docks, a long cloak trailing like smoke. I fired, but the figure melted into the darkness, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the whisper of the river. When I returned, Holmes was examining the broken mirror. Behind it, hidden in the plaster, he had uncovered a small compartment containing a roll of parchment tied with ribbon. Upon it was written, "Property of the Lyceum Theatre. Costume Ledger, 1879. He unrolled it swiftly. The pages listed names, actors, seamstresses, patrons, but one entry caught his eye. Patron, Lord Alistair Pennington. Investment, £10,000. Production title, The Duchess of Death. Author unknown. Holmes's expression darkened. Pennington again, the nobleman whose pride outstripped his virtue. He replaced the scroll, his mind already racing ahead. Watson, we must visit his residence before dawn. This web begins and ends with him. The woman in grey rose weakly, eyes filled with terror. You don't understand, she whispered. He doesn't live in that house anymore. He never did. It's just another stage. Then, where? Holmes pressed. Her answer came almost as a sob. He performs beneath it. Holmes met my gaze, and for the first time since the case began, I saw something in his eyes I could not name, an unease deeper than fear. Then, he said softly, the true theatre has yet to reveal its audience. The candle sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. Somewhere, across the river, a clock struck 3, and the fog outside turned black. The dawn that followed was the sort of pallid, reluctant dawn London grants to those who have not slept. Thin light smeared across a sky the colour of old pewter, chimneys coughing up their blackened breath, the streets slick with a cold that insinuated itself into one's bones. Holmes and I took a hansom from Limehouse to the Lyceum with scarcely a word exchanged between us. He sat hunched within the cab, chin sunk upon his chest, eyes half-lidded, not in fatigue but in that singular inward concentration that made his face a mask of ascetic severity. When at last he spoke, it was as though he were continuing a conversation that had begun before I'd been born. You observed the wording of the letter, the mirror cracks. A theatrical metaphor, yes, but also a practical instruction. A mirror is not merely a surface, it is a door when prepared by the stage carpenter's art. We found one such door in Limehouse. I suspect another lies where her role began, in the dressing room that wore her like a perfume. The theatre, emptier by daylight than it had seemed at midnight, received us with the hush one associates with a closed church. A solitary porter admitted us and shuffled away, cap in hand. The auditorium, stripped of its evening finery, showed scaffolds and paint pots, dust motes drifting in oblique beams from the high windows. Even the curtain, rumpled and slack, looked suddenly human in its exhaustion. Holmes went straight to the passage behind the wings, past heaps of timber and coils of rope, to the corridor of dressing rooms painted a dismal cream that the sun could not improve. The brass plaque still read, Miss Ormond, Private. Henry Vale had posted a notice forbidding entry, but he had also placed the key beneath the same chipped seashell on the skirting board, as if daring fate to disobey him. The room had not been tidied since our last visit. Indeed, it seemed that someone had deliberately prevented any hand from rearranging that chaos. Silk stockings lay in an attitude of collapse over the back of a chair. A fan with mother-of-pearl sticks rested upon the carpet like a frozen ripple. Cracked bottles of scent bled their pale ghosts into the air. Holmes shut the door behind us, turned the key, and stood motionless for several seconds, inhaling with minute attention. Rouge, rice powder, orris root, he murmured. Jasmine again, fainter here than in Limehouse, which suggests not the same bottle, but the same habit. And something else. Rosewater, though that may be. Conventional. He knelt at the hearth, pinched a sample of ash, and rubbed it between forefinger and thumb. Not coal, burnt paper. The edges show the creamy decal of French stationery. Someone destroyed correspondence here and did it in haste. I moved, almost without intention, to the mirror. Its surface had been polished to a brutal clarity that mocked the wreckage of the room. On the wide table beneath it, amidst combs, hairpins, and a sad confusion of broken glass, lay a tin of face powder decorated with a garland of painted roses. "Holmes," I said, "you are right to speak of doors. This one at least may open." I lifted the tin. It rattled in my hand with a sound too heavy for powder. Holmes was beside me in an instant. He set the tin upon the table and examined the rim, his lens flashing. "A later crimp to the metal," he said softly. "The hinge has been tampered with." He took a small blade from his pocket and worked it gently under the lip, then pried. The lid gave with a breathy sigh. Within lay not powder, but a neat fold of tissue enclosing a pressed rose, its petals browned at the edges, yet still holding their form with a dignity that moved me. Beneath the flower, creased into a slender slip, rested a card scored into tiny squares, each square bearing a hand-drawn symbol: harp, mask, dagger, crown, arranged in a grid of 9 by 6. "A paper rose, a cipher garden," Holmes murmured, lifting the card by its corners. "And this," he touched the petals with surprising tenderness, "has a scent beyond its years. The rose water you detected, Watson, is not mere atmosphere. It is a deliberate preservative. Someone wished this token to endure." The symbols, once my eyes grew accustomed, were not random at all. They were the common emblems printed upon the Lyceum's prompt books and property lists. Shorthand livery for a kingdom of illusion. Holmes set the card upon the table and drew his notebook nearer. "Consider the arrangement," he said. "Rows and columns equal to the number of acts and scenes common to our melodrama. And here, see how the dagger repeats where a scene change would necessitate the turning of the stage. A playbill cipher, then. The key must be a text at once ubiquitous and invisible to those who do not live upon the boards." He looked about the room with that quick, bird-like darting of gaze I had come to know as the tremor before discovery. His hand fell upon the playbill Lestrade had sent us, the same that bore the smear of old blood. He laid it flat, aligned the cipher's grid over its columns, and pressed the card against the paper so that the symbols selected certain letters beneath. It was the old soldier's trick of a grill, made theatrical. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "A director's cruelty," he said. "He hides his secret in the single object every patron tosses away." He read, at first in fragments, then in growing coherence as the letters appeared under the emblem's empty windows. I copied them out as he spoke. "When the masquerade ends, send the locket to the house that is not a house. Beneath the lion's tail. Midnight." "The lion's tail," I repeated. "Is that a heraldic reference? A noble crest?" "It is a sculpture," Holmes replied at once. "There is a bronze lion atop the arch of Pennington Mews, a ridiculous ornament he commissioned to remind his tenants whose shadow they inhabit. The tail, if memory serves, hangs over a postern that few notice. The house that is not a house? A stage built beneath the residence, as our understudy suggested. It is theatre all the way down." He set aside the card and turned to the pressed flower. "The rose, however, is not merely sentimental." He held the stem to the light. There, along the most delicate vein, ran the faintest track of ink, as if a whisper had been written in capillaries. He moistened a brush, passed it once over the petal, and blotted the wash upon a clean page. The stain resolved, astonishingly, into a monogram in miniature, E.O., bracketed by a tiny crown. "The crown again," I said, "a sign of patronage." "A sign," Holmes returned, "of ownership and rebellion. If she marked the flower with her initials, she claimed the fiction as her own. If the crown is his, she sets them side by side and makes a vow of separation. Poetry is often the only knife a powerless woman may carry." He placed the rose back upon its tissue with a reverence I had witnessed him give to the relics of saints and villains alike. "We must not break it. It has already done its work." He crossed to the door, paused, and knelt to the floor. With his nail, he traced the faint line of a join between two boards, prized up a sliver of wood, and exposed a shallow recess no larger than a letter. It was empty, save for one thing I did not at first recognize. A pin of the sort used to fasten wigs, its head dipped in sealing wax. The wax bore the impression of a lion's tail. Holmes's glance struck me like a spark. "The cue is given," he said. "We go to Pennington Mews." We left by the stage door and took another hansom through streets that had begun to populate with milk carts and yawning apprentices. Holmes kept the glass half lowered and watched the pavement as if it might speak. At Wellington Street he rapped twice upon the roof, and the driver veered across the flow of early traffic into a narrower road bordered with respectable brick fronts and a single ostentatious arch from which the bronze lion regarded the world with iron contempt. Its tail, indeed, hung in a ridiculous curl over a small, ill-painted door set into the stone, a mean portal for so proud a beast. Holmes alighted and paid the jarvey with an absent nod. He examined the door's lock and smiled in that dry manner that always boded trouble for someone else. "New screws in old wood," he observed. "They did not expect a caller at this hour." From his pocket came a thin strip of tempered metal. The wards surrendered in silence. The door opened upon a stair that immediately surrendered to blackness and a draught that smelled of damp velvet and old sweat, the archaeology of 100 performances. We descended. The stairs gave way to a passage, the passage to a corridor, and at last to a chamber so large and so secretly prepared that for a breath I wondered if we had somehow stepped beneath the river. It was a theatre indeed, but a theatre for private appetites. A low stage hung with faded burgundy, a dozen chairs in 2 tidy ranks, a gallery above curtained in black gauze, and behind the gauze the outline of an enclosed box from which an unseen spectator might survey his dominion with perfect impunity. Beneath the gallery, to one side, stood a pedestal upon which rested a velvet cushion. Upon the cushion lay a silver locket whose hinge had been broken, as if by the same hand that had sent it to Baker Street. Holmes did not touch it. He looked instead to the wings, where a pair of mannequins in half-sewn gowns leaned together like conspirators. He looked to the prompt corner where a little bell, the sort used to call actors to places, waited beside a book of cues. He looked to the footlights, whose jets had been capped, but whose pipes, he noted with a desultory finger, had recently been wiped clean. "We are late," he said, so softly I scarcely heard him. "Or we are exactly on time." A breath of air, scarcely more than a suggestion of motion, stirred the gauze of the gallery. Holmes and I both turned. From behind that black veil came the faintest rasp, as of gloved hands upon a wooden rail. Then a voice, amplified by the hush, descended as coolly as the first note of a performance. "Mr. Holmes," it said, "how punctual you are when roses lead the way." The gauze did not part. The voice was neither near nor far. It seemed to arise from the room itself, as if the air had put on a cloak. Holmes' face became the stone facade of a temple. "You arrange your stages with admirable industry," he said. "Will you arrange your name?" "The audience never needs the author's name," the voice returned. "Only the illusion." Holmes's eyes swept the room once more. He did not look at me, but I understood the command in his stillness and shifted 2 paces left, toward the wing where the bell lay. "Illusion," he said, "is a profession. Murder is not. Where is Evangeline Ormond?" A pause, long enough for an actor to let the house lean forward. And then, "She chose to leave before the curtain call. But if you must have your sentiment, Doctor, look beneath the velvet where the locket rests. You will find the truth there, as men always do. Too late." Holmes moved. So did I. He reached the pedestal and lifted the cushion with 2 careful fingers. Beneath lay a folded program, its paper thick, its edges gilt. He opened it. Inside, a single line had been written in a brisk, confident hand. Her name was never hers, but the blood that paid for it was. Below the flourish, the letter A interlaced with a tiny crown. Holmes exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been the ghost of a laugh. "Pennington's cipher again," he said. "The bloodline writes its confession in initials." The voice from the gallery, still velvet, still mild, spoke once more. "Say her name, Mr. Holmes, and you shatter a house whose bricks are titles and whose mortar is reputation. Spare it, and you may keep your conscience as pretty as a pressed flower. You are eminently a man of taste. Choose." Holmes closed the program with a snap that sounded very loud in the small theatre. "I never choose between a false mercy and a true crime," he said. "I extract the truth and let the world decide whether to be worthy of it." A faint rustle, as of someone rising. Then silence. The gauze did not move again. Holmes vaulted to the gallery stairs in 3 strides, but when we thrust behind the curtain, the box was empty, the little door at its back ajar, and beyond it a crawl space that ran like a vein through the stone, exhaling the same cold breath we had felt at the lion's tail. We followed it as far as light and pulse permitted, but it divided and narrowed, and at last Holmes halted with an uncharacteristic shudder of impatience. "We have enough," he said. "We were not meant to catch a cloak tonight, only to understand the price stitched into its lining." He held up the program and the locket together as if weighing them, then slipped both into his pocket. "There is a family in London that taught a chorus of girls to wear a single name, and to bleed for it when the applause became inconvenient. That is not theatre. That is commerce, writ in scarlet." When we emerged again into the day, the city had found its colour. Omnibuses rumbled, flower sellers called from corners. The fog had lifted enough to show a mild, indifferent strip of sky. Holmes hailed a cab with a whistle, sharp as a knife. "Baker Street first," he said, "then to St. James's. We shall see whether Lord Alistair Pennington prefers confession in the language of art or in the plain prose of a magistrate's summons. Either way, the next scene is his." The cab started. The bronze lion above the mews held its ridiculous pose, tail curled as if to salute or mock us. I looked back once and thought I saw, high in the shadow of the arch, the faintest movement, nothing more than a fold of black settling against stone. It might have been a trick of light, it might have been an audience departing. The pressed rose lay between Holmes's notebook leaves upon his knee. He did not touch it. He stared instead at the middle distance with that expression I had learned to interpret as pity forfeited to purpose. The wheels took up their rhythm, and the houses slid by, and something in me whispered that the curtain would not fall gently this time. It would be torn down by hand. The carriage jolted to a halt before Pennington House. A towering edifice of Georgian austerity crouched behind its wrought iron gates like a predator at rest. The facade glimmered faintly under the dawn's reluctant light, its stone mottled by soot, its columns worn smooth by centuries of propriety. Even at that early hour, the place exuded the kind of wealth that demanded silence from the world around it. Holmes stepped out first, his gaze sweeping upward with the scrutiny of a surgeon examining a corpse for its first wound. "Observe the windows," he murmured. Closed shutters, yet candles burnt to stubs within. Someone watched the night through, but not for sleep. We were admitted by a butler whose thinness rivaled that of his master's patience. The man's face was a study in discretion, pale, bloodless, and utterly void of curiosity. "Lord Pennington is not receiving visitors," he said. "He will make an exception," Holmes replied, handing him a card. "Tell his lordship that Sherlock Holmes brings a relic of the Lyceum Theatre, a performance that may yet demand his applause." The butler hesitated, then retreated. A minute later, we were ushered into a drawing-room whose air was thick with perfume and cigarette smoke. The curtains were drawn despite the morning. From a chair by the hearth rose Lord Alistair Pennington, tall, gaunt, his hair a shade too black to be honest, his eyes cold and quick as polished obsidian. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice smooth as lacquer. I have heard your name whispered in the corridors of power, and in the gutters alike. Which audience do you perform for today?" Holmes smiled without warmth. "For truth, my lord, and she is a most demanding patron." Pennington gestured languidly. "Then by all means, perform." Holmes placed the broken locket upon the mantel, beside a gilt-framed portrait of a woman so exquisitely painted that even her stillness seemed alive. The resemblance to Evangeline Ormond was unmistakable. "You were her patron," Holmes said. "You financed The Duchess of Death and several productions before it. Your influence extended beyond the stage, into her life and, I suspect, into her disappearance." Pennington's lips curved faintly. "Influence is a vulgar word. I prefer devotion. She was an investment of the soul, not the purse." "And yet," Holmes said softly, "when an investment yields independence, the financier often resorts to ruin." The air tightened. For a heartbeat, I thought Pennington might strike him. Instead, the nobleman crossed to the decanter, poured a measure of brandy, and spoke with careful levity. "You mistake melodrama for motive, Mr. Holmes. The woman was an actress. They vanish as easily as applause." Holmes's eyes flicked to a side table where a leather portfolio lay half-concealed beneath correspondence. "May I?" he asked, already moving. Pennington's voice dropped an octave. "I would advise against it." But Holmes had opened the portfolio before the warning finished. Within were a series of documents: birth certificates, theater contracts, and letters written in the same violet ink we had seen in Limehouse. Holmes drew one forth. "A baptismal record for Evangeline Ormond, dated 1870, signed by Reverend Henry Vale. Curious. Your stage manager bears the same name." Pennington said nothing. Holmes continued, his tone clinical, inexorable. "Except this certificate is false. The parish seal is misaligned by 2 degrees, a forgery. And yet its purpose is clear, to create a lineage where none existed, to make of a nameless girl a woman of refinement, suitable for your company and your scandal." The nobleman's composure wavered. His hand trembled slightly as he refilled his glass. "You speak as though purity were a currency to be protected. In my world, it is merely a garment, worn for the crowd, discarded when the curtain falls." "Then you confess you manufactured her?" Holmes said quietly. "I confess nothing," Pennington snapped. "She wished for fame. I gave her the tools. A name, a story, an audience. She was grateful until gratitude became unfashionable." He turned away, staring into the fire. "When she defied me, she destroyed more than herself. She risked unraveling an enterprise that extended far beyond one stage." Holmes's gaze hardened. "An enterprise built on bloodlines, perhaps. I've seen your cipher, the crown entwined with the letter A. I know its meaning. You have made of art a weapon for laundering shame. Daughters born in secrecy, paraded as stars to distract the public from the scandals of their sires. A playhouse of penitence disguised as glamour." Pennington laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "You moralize beautifully, Mr. Holmes, but you understand nothing of power. It is not cruelty that drives men like me. It is necessity. Do you imagine the nobility can afford bastards? We clothe our sins in satin and let the world applaud them." The words struck me like a blow. I saw Holmes's knuckles tighten on the mantel, though his voice remained composed. "And when the actress refuses to play her role?" "She is written out," Pennington said simply. "One must protect the script." The silence that followed was colder than any fog. Holmes turned to me, eyes glinting with restrained fury. "Watson, note this conversation. It will prove invaluable at the inquest." Pennington smiled again, though the expression trembled. "You presume a corpse exists? Do you deny it?" "I deny everything that cannot be proven," he said. "And you, sir, have no body, only stories." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the rose we had found, still pressed within its tissue. He laid it upon the portfolio. "Then let this be our witness," he said, "a flower that survived both the grave and the lie. Its veins hold your monogram, my lord, ink of your making, blood of your vanity, and she, whoever she truly was, carried it like a wound." For the first time, Pennington's mask fractured. His voice sank to a whisper. "You cannot prove I killed her." Holmes regarded him evenly. "Perhaps not, but I can prove you created her, and that, in its way, is the same thing." The nobleman's eyes blazed. "You meddle in affairs far above your station. Walk carefully, detective. The stage upon which you tread is older and darker than you can fathom." Holmes turned to leave. "Then pray the curtain never falls upon it." We were halfway to the door when Pennington spoke again, softly, almost to himself. "She begged me to let her go, said she wanted her own name. I told her there was no such thing, only the one I gave her." He stared into the fire as though it might speak her back to life. And yet, when the mirror broke, I saw her eyes in the shards. Holmes paused, but did not turn. "A confession, my lord." "A memory," Pennington said. "A useless one." Outside, the air bit at our faces like punishment. Holmes walked fast, the set of his shoulders taut as wire. "He did not kill her," he said at least not with his hands, "but he built the stage upon which she was sacrificed. That is murder enough for me." "And now?" I asked. He stopped beneath a lamp-post, its weak flame flickering in the wind. "Now, Watson, we go back to Baker Street. There is a thread still dangling, one tied not to a man of title, but to a woman who never truly existed. If we follow it, we may yet find the truth. And perhaps her." The fog closed around us once more, soft as gauze, concealing both shame and pursuit. As we entered the waiting cab, I glanced back at Pennington House. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a pale figure at the window, a woman's silhouette framed against the dawn. Then it was gone, and only the reflection of the street lamps remained. Holmes did not speak again that morning. He sat with the locket in his hand, turning it slowly as though the motion might unlock not the clasp, but the heart that once beat behind it. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street, curling through the gaslight like pale smoke from a dying fire. The city was silent except for the distant creak of a carriage wheel and the mournful cry of a watchman somewhere near Oxford Street. Inside our familiar rooms, the hearth burned low, its glow reflected in the scattered clutter of case notes, newspapers, and half-empty teacups that littered Holmes's desk. He moved through the haze of tobacco and lamplight like a phantom at work, pacing in slow, restless arcs, his dressing gown drawn close about him, his violin resting untouched beside the armchair. For an hour he spoke little, content to sort the fragments of the case with his mind alone. I sat opposite, exhausted yet unable to sleep, the day's revelations still burning in my thoughts. The false birth record, the counterfeit identity, the confession of a nobleman who had crafted a living ghost for the sake of respectability. The very air of Baker Street seemed charged with that ghost's presence. Holmes paused at last beside the window, staring out through the thin mist that clung to the panes. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "we have been playing our own part upon a stage of his construction. Lord Pennington, the cloaked figure, the woman in grey. They are all actors, each bound to a script written in the ink of power. But there remains a question, none of them answered." He turned, eyes bright beneath the shadow of the lamp. "Who wrote the play itself?" Before I could reply, he crossed to the mantel, seized his bow, and drew it once across the violin's strings. The sound, a single, low note that vibrated like a pulse beneath the heart, filled the room and faded. "When reason exhausts itself," he murmured, "music remains. It speaks to the pattern beneath all patterns." He began to play softly, his bow tracing a melody at once mournful and deliberate, each phrase circling back upon itself like a question that would not die. The hour grew late. I must have drifted towards sleep in my chair, for I remember the faint chime of the clock striking midnight just as a knock sounded at the door. 3 quick raps, then silence. Holmes stopped playing at once. He exchanged a look with me that required no words and moved to answer. Mrs. Hudson's voice called faintly from below. "A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Urgent." He took it from her hand and tore it open beneath the lamp. The paper was thin, the ink still damp. He read once, and I saw the muscles of his jaw tighten. Then, without a word, he passed it to me. "The play resumes at midnight. The stage is set. Bring the locket." It bore no signature, but the origin mark was unmistakable. Lyceum Theatre. Holmes's expression hardened into resolve. "They mean to finish it, Watson. Every act ends where it began. We are to attend the final performance." "You can't possibly intend to go unarmed," I said. "On the contrary," he replied, slipping his revolver into his pocket. "We go armed with truth. Bullets will serve us little against illusion." He extinguished the lamps, leaving only the fire to cast its glow upon the walls. The coals hissed softly as he retrieved the silver locket from the table and held it up so that its surface caught the light. "A prop, a talisman, or a key," he said. "Whatever its purpose, it has been the constant in every act. Let us see what curtain it opens tonight." We left Baker Street beneath a moon, pale and indifferent above the fog. The city seemed to hold its breath. When we reached the Strand, the Lyceum loomed before us, dark, deserted, its grand facade glistening with damp. Yet the front doors, which had been locked the day before, now stood slightly ajar. Inside, the theatre was cloaked in silence. Dust motes drifted through the shafts of moonlight that spilled from the high windows, and the scent of grease paint and old velvet clung to the air like perfume from a vanished audience. Holmes moved along the aisle, lantern raised, until the faint gleam of something metallic caught his eye upon the stage. It was a single rose laid across the boards, identical to the one we had found before, its petals beginning to blacken. Beneath it, a card read, "For the detective who mistook art for crime." Holmes's mouth curved faintly, though not in amusement. "They mock us, Watson, yet mockery implies fear." He mounted the stage, scanning the curtains, the trap-door, the wings. Every detail of the space seemed subtly altered, the scenery arranged not for a performance, but for an illusion meant for us alone. I followed, revolver drawn. Then came the faintest sound, the creak of a pulley above, followed by the slow rise of the stage curtain. Behind it stood a single figure, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, the woman in grey. Her hood was lowered now, revealing a face pale as porcelain, eyes wide with exhaustion and dread. "Miss Ormond," I breathed. Holmes's voice was level. "No, not Ormond. Only the shadow left behind." She turned to us, her voice low, urgent. "You must leave. He's here, beneath the stage." "The director?" Holmes asked. She nodded, trembling. "He never left. This theatre is his cathedral. He says the play cannot end until you've taken your burr." A hollow click echoed from below, the sound of a mechanism being drawn. Then the boards at the center of the stage shuddered and began to part. A trap door lifted like the lid of a coffin, and from its darkness rose the figure we had pursued since that first night, the man in the opera cloak. His mask caught the lamplight in a glint of silver. Holmes stepped forward. At last, the author steps into view. The masked man spread his gloved hands in mock applause. "Every play requires a critic," he said, his voice resonant, theatrical. "But you, Mr. Holmes, are the finest audience I've ever known. You follow every cue, question every line. You even brought the prop I requested." His gaze flicked toward the locket. "How touching." Holmes's tone was cold. "If you wished for admiration, you might have chosen a safer occupation than murder." "Murder?" the man repeated, amused. "Oh no, my dear detective. You mistake metamorphosis for death. The woman you seek wanted freedom from the name you all adored. I merely gave her the stage upon which to shed it. Holmes's jaw tightened. Where is she now? In every story that bears her name, the man replied. In every whisper that asks what became of Evangeline Ormond. Immortality wears many masks. I gave her one. Then you confess? I confess to art, he said. To creation. Holmes raised the locket. And this? What role does this trinket play in your creation? The man's laughter was low, echoing through the hollow theater. Open it, if you dare. Holmes hesitated only a moment before prying the broken hinge. Inside lay not the miniature portrait we had seen before, but a fragment of stage script written in tiny, precise hand. Scene 9, the detective confronts himself. Holmes's breath caught, though his face betrayed nothing. A jest, he said. A revelation, the man countered. The truth you chase is not hers, Mr. Holmes. It is yours. You seek meaning where there is only design, morality where there is only theater. Look around you. The world adores illusions. You of all men should understand. The audience does not want truth. It wants performance. For a heartbeat, the silence was complete. Then Holmes spoke, his voice quiet but cutting as steel. You mistake me for an actor. I am the mirror you fear. He stepped forward. The masked man moved back toward the open trap door. Their shadows merged upon the boards like two halves of the same figure. Step back, Holmes, I called, but he did not. The man laughed once more, a sound of triumph or surrender, I could not tell, and dropped into the darkness below. Holmes reached the edge and peered down, but the space beneath was empty. Only the echo of water and the slow, receding clatter of footsteps remained. He closed the trapdoor carefully, then turned to the woman in grey. He's gone, he said. She shook her head. He was never here, not as you think. The director is whoever wears the mask. She looked toward the empty stalls, where the fog had begun to seep in through the broken doors. And tonight, Mr. Holmes, you've worn it well. Holmes did not answer. He looked at the locket one last time, then snapped it shut and dropped it into the orchestra pit. The clang echoed once, sharp as a pistol shot. Then let the play end here, he said. Outside, the first light of morning began to pale the rooftops. As we stepped back into the street, the theater behind us stood silent, its great doors closing with a groan that sounded to my weary mind like a sigh of relief. Holmes walked beside me, his face unreadable, the fog curling around his boots like smoke from a vanished fire. He spoke only once as we turned into the Strand. Watson, he said, some truths are not solved. They are survived. We did not return to Baker Street that night. Holmes insisted on remaining close to the theatre, and so we took temporary refuge in a lodging house off Maiden Lane, a narrow, crooked building whose windows looked upon the black, rain-polished cobbles of the Strand. The room was sparse, a single candle, 2 wooden chairs, and the hollow sound of dripping water in the walls. Holmes sat at the table with the faint light burning before him, the locket gone, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude which I had learned to interpret as a sign that his mind was engaged upon a problem whose dimensions even he had not yet measured. For the better part of an hour, he did not move. Then, without looking up, he said in a tone of quiet wonder, "Do you know, Watson, I believe we have been led through the world's oldest illusion." I stirred. "You mean the woman's disappearance? The masquerade of identities?" "Far older than that," he replied. "The illusion that truth can be separated from theatre, that motive can exist without audience. Every action, every confession, every murder in this case has been staged for us. Even Pennington's outrage was a performance, one rehearsed with exquisite precision." He rose suddenly, seized his hat, and moved toward the door. The letter said the play resumes at midnight. It did. But there was a second cue buried in that line. One we ignored. And what was that? that the play does not end until the audience departs. We walked out before the final act concluded. I stared. You believe it's still in progress? I believe, he said, that someone remains upon that stage, waiting for us to notice the last curtain has not yet fallen. We returned to the Lyceum in silence. The streets were empty but for the watchman's distant whistle and the hiss of rain along the paving stones. When the theater came into view, it looked as it had before, dark, silent, abandoned. Yet something in its stillness was wrong. The front doors, which we had closed upon leaving, now gaped open once more. Holmes entered first, his lantern slicing through the dark like a scalpel. The air inside was colder than before, heavy with the scent of gas and damp fabric. Our footsteps echoed faintly through the hall. Upon the stage, the rose we had left was gone. Holmes advanced to the footlights, crouched, and pressed his fingers against the boards. "Feel this, Watson," he said. I knelt beside him. The wood was faintly warm. "The pipes," he whispered. "They've been relit." A faint hum stirred beneath our feet, like the breath of something waking. Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing toward the gallery above. "We are no longer alone." From the shadows came the soft rustle of movement. Silk against velvet. The figure of the woman in gray appeared once more at the edge of the stage, her hood drawn up, her face obscured. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice distant, hollow. Holmes faced her calmly. "And yet here we are. The play insists on completion." She shook her head slowly. "Completion requires sacrifice." "Whose?" "Yours." At that instant, a sharp click echoed from above. Holmes spun toward the source, but before he could move further, a heavy counterweight fell from the rigging, striking the stage with a thunderous crack that sent dust and splinters into the air. Another followed, then another, each dropping in sequence like a perverse applause. The entire mechanism of the stage began to tremble. The ropes creaking, the floorboards shifting beneath us. Holmes caught my arm. "The trap is set to collapse. Quickly, off the stage." We leapt to the orchestra pit, just as a section of the floor gave way behind us. Through the gap, I saw the black hollow beneath, the labyrinth we had glimpsed before. Ropes, pulleys, and the gleam of wet stone. The heat we had felt came not from gaslight, but from the machinery itself. Someone had ignited a slow-burning charge along the undercarriage of the stage. Holmes's eyes darted to the wings. "There, cut the main valve." I followed his gesture and found a lever half hidden behind a drape. I wrenched it down with both hands, the hiss of gas subsiding instantly. Silence fell, broken only by the echo of dripping water. Holmes stood breathing hard, his gaze sweeping the shattered boards. "A stage that consumes itself," he murmured, "the perfect metaphor." The woman in grey was gone. He crossed to where she had stood and found, upon the boards, a single scrap of silk torn from her cloak. "No blood," he said softly. "No body, only exits." Before I could answer, a sound rose from below. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing the darkness beneath the stage. Holmes raised his lantern, and through the gash in the floor we glimpsed a pale mask moving through the void, the silver catching the light like a blade. "The director," Holmes whispered. The figure looked up and for the first time spoke not in mockery but in calm, deliberate invitation. "Come down, Mr. Holmes. The play is almost over." Without hesitation, Holmes leapt through the opening, landing cat-like upon the lower level. I followed, less gracefully, my lantern swinging. The space beneath the stage stretched like a catacomb, a forest of ropes, wooden beams, and rusted scaffolds. At its center stood a small platform lit by a single lantern. Upon it rested an open ledger and a silver mask identical to the one worn by the director. Holmes approached cautiously, his revolver steady. "Show yourself," he said. The shadows stirred, and from behind the machinery stepped the man himself, unmasked at last. It was not Pennington, nor any of the actors we had seen, but Henry Vale, the stage manager. His face was pale, his eyes fever-bright. Holmes exhaled softly. Of course, the director was not the patron, but the craftsman. You built the illusion. Vale smiled faintly. Every man builds something, Mr. Holmes. Some build houses, others lies. I built faith, faith that the stage could birth gods and bury ghosts. You killed her, I said. He shook his head. No, Doctor. I liberated her. She came to me the night before the final performance, begging to be erased, to vanish as completely as any character she had ever played. I gave her that gift. Holmes's voice cut through the gloom. And the body? Vale gestured toward the dark water pooled beneath the floorboards. There is no body, only a name that drowned willingly. Holmes's revolver remained steady, but I could hear the faint tremor in his breath. You took her life to preserve your art. I took nothing, Vale said, stepping closer to the light. I merely allowed her to choose her ending. The world adores tragedy more than truth. You, of all men, should understand that. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain above had grown heavier, drumming faintly on the roof. Then Holmes said, almost gently, You've rehearsed this speech before. Vale's eyes flickered. Perhaps, but I never expected such an audience. In one swift motion, he lifted the lantern and hurled it to the ground. The flame burst across the boards, catching the oil that had seeped from the machinery. Fire leapt upward, licking the wooden beams like tongues of gold. Holmes sprang forward, grappling with him. The two men crashed against the scaffolding, their shadows twisting amid the smoke. I lunged to help, but Vale wrenched free and stumbled back toward the water's edge. For an instant, the firelight revealed his face, transfixed, almost joyous. The curtain falls, he cried, and threw himself into the dark below. I reached the edge, but the water had already swallowed him. Only his cloak floated there, black and silent as ash. Holmes stood motionless, the flames reflected in his eyes. He built his stage well, he said at last. Even his death obeyed the script. We found our way out through a service corridor that led to the alley behind the theater. The night air struck cold and sharp against the heat we carried with us. Behind us, the Lyceum's roof began to glow faintly, smoke rising through the rain like incense from a dying altar. Holmes did not look back. The audience will awaken to find the stage burned, he said quietly. They will call it an accident. The papers will speak of faulty gas pipes, of negligence, of loss. They will not mention the woman who was never born, or the man who built her. As we turned toward Baker Street, the first bells of morning rang faintly over the city, distant yet solemn. Holmes's silhouette cut against the mist, tall, lean, and solitary. It is finished, then, I said. He shook his head. No, Watson. A play ends when the curtain falls. But truth keeps playing in the dark. Morning came reluctantly to Baker Street, pale and indifferent, as if London itself were weary of revelations. The fire had burned low in the grate, its embers giving the room a dull, crimson glow that barely pushed back the gloom. Holmes sat in his chair, his profile carved against the weak light from the window, the smoke from his pipe curling upward like the ghost of the night we had survived. His coat still smelled faintly of the Lyceum's smoke and the river's rot. I too had slept little, though exhaustion clung to me like frost. Yet Holmes was not still. His eyes were alive with that bright, inward flame that always burned when the line between truth and madness grew dangerously thin. On the table between us lay the remains of our investigation, a torn glove, the broken locket, and a page from the theater's ledger that Holmes had salvaged from the fire before it consumed the stage. The ink had bled from the heat, but 3 words remained legible. The Duchess lives. Do you see it, Watson? Holmes asked at last, his voice quiet but taut. It was never about a single woman. The Duchess was not a character. She was an inheritance. I frowned, still trying to clear my mind of the smoke and chaos. You mean the name passed from one actress to another? Not merely actresses, he replied, leaning forward, the pipe forgotten. Identities, Watson. Masks of convenience passed along a bloodline of shame. Pennington's wealth, Vale's genius, Ormond's beauty, all threads of the same design. The women were chosen, trained, renamed, and when their usefulness ended, they vanished into the fog. But this one, this final Duchess, refused to die upon command. He opened his violin case and withdrew a folded sheet of paper from beneath the lining. It was stained, brittle, and smelled faintly of rosewater. Across the top, written in the same violet ink as before, was a single line. If truth is a play, then confession is its final act. Holmes looked up. This was found hidden in the violin case upon my return. Mrs. Hudson swears no one entered the rooms. Yet here it lies, addressed to me. The letter inside was brief but trembling with urgency. Mr. Holmes, the fire was not an end, but a cleansing. He is gone, yet his creation breathes still. I cannot flee what I have been. Come to the Lyceum at dusk. The Duchess must confess before the audience forgets her name. Holmes read it aloud, his tone steady, but his eyes shadowed with a strange melancholy. She means to return to the ashes of her stage. I shook my head. Holmes, the theatre is gutted, half collapsed. She'll be killed. He rose abruptly, already reaching for his coat. Then we shall be her final spectators, Watson. No tragedy deserves to play to an empty house. By the time we reached the Strand, the sun was dying behind a veil of rain. The Lyceum stood blackened and broken, its upper windows hollow, the facade streaked with soot. Yet a faint light glimmered within. A single lamp burning defiantly amid ruin. Holmes drew his revolver but kept it lowered. No police, he said. No interruptions. This must conclude as it began, upon the boards. Inside, the theatre was transformed. The stage, though charred, had been cleared of debris. Someone had swept the ashes into neat piles and placed candles along the edge in a semicircle. In their flickering light stood the woman in grey, unhooded now, her features bare and terrible in their calm. She wore a gown of silver silk torn at the hem, streaked with soot. Behind her, the tattered curtain hung like a funeral shroud. Miss Ormond, Holmes began gently, or whatever name you claim, why summon us back into this grave? She turned, her eyes luminous in the candlelight. Because graves are honest, Mr. Holmes. The living are not. Holmes stepped closer. You survived the fire. I did, she said softly. He would not let me die until the story was finished. Henry Vale built his masterpiece, and I, his creation, was meant to vanish within it. But even he did not know the full script. There was another hand guiding him. Pennington, Holmes said. She nodded. He financed the illusion, but he also feared it. The first Duchess was his child by a servant girl. When she died, he sought to bury the scandal in beauty and applause. He found another girl, gave her the same name, the same locket, and let the crowd believe in reincarnation. Year after year, generation upon generation, the Duchess returned. It became a myth, and in time, a prison. She paused, her voice trembling. When my turn came, I thought it a gift, to be loved, adored, immortal. But I learned the truth too late. Each Duchess was erased when her age or conscience made her inconvenient. Vale merely continued the ritual. Holmes regarded her gravely. And now you mean to end it? She gave a faint, sorrowful smile. Confession is the only way to kill a myth. From the shadows at the back of the stage came a movement, a whisper of cloth, a soft metallic click. Holmes turned sharply, revolver raised. A man stepped into the candlelight, face streaked with soot but unmistakable. Henry Vale. He was alive. Mr. Holmes, he said hoarsely, his eyes glittering. You should have stayed away. She's not what you think. The woman flinched. You're supposed to be dead. He smiled faintly. Every director knows how to exit unseen. The river took only my reflection. Holmes moved between them, weapon steady. Enough of this masquerade. The fire, the disappearances, the lies. It ends here. Tell the truth, Vale. The truth? Vale echoed. You want truth? Very well. He turned to the woman. Tell him your name. Tell him who gave you the script you hold so dearly. She shook her head, tears glimmering. No. Vale's voice rose, feverish. Tell him, or I shall. Holmes's gaze flicked between them, his face unreadable. Then I shall tell it for you, he said. The ledger you wrote survived long enough to speak. The Duchess was never a woman. It was a society, an enterprise of power and corruption disguised as art. The patrons supplied their daughters, their mistresses, their secrets. And you, Vale, made of them performances so convincing that the audience never knew it applauded its own guilt. Vale's face twisted. You cannot destroy art, Mr. Holmes. It survives exposure. Holmes's tone sharpened. Then you misunderstand what art is. Yours was not creation, but concealment. You painted over sin with tragedy and called it beauty. The woman stepped forward suddenly, voice breaking. Enough. You speak of guilt, but you are both guilty. He made me his fiction, and you... Her gaze fixed on Holmes. You made me your case. Her hands trembled as she raised the silver locket, the hinge now mended. Inside, this is not a portrait, she said, opening it. It's a mirror. Every duchess carried one, to remind her that her face was never truly hers. Look, Mr. Holmes. Look at what you seek to solve. Holmes hesitated, then leaned closer. In the reflection, distorted by flame and shadow, I saw not the woman's face, but his own, drawn, haunted, multiplied by the flicker of candles until it seemed a dozen. Holmes's stared back, each colder than the last. She dropped the locket to the stage, where it shattered with a brittle crack. The candles guttered in the draught, and in that wavering light, her expression softened into something almost peaceful. Now the mirror breaks, she whispered. Vale stepped toward her, but she turned away. No more performances, she said, and with a sudden, terrible calm, she stepped into the darkness behind the curtain. A sound followed. Soft, final, unmistakable. The hush that comes only when life ceases to pretend. Holmes lowered his revolver slowly. The firelight caught his profile, sharp and pale. He did not move for a long while. When at last he spoke, his voice was hollow. The play is finished. Vale sank to his knees beside the shattered locket, weeping without sound. She was the last, he murmured. The audience will forget. They always do. Holmes turned to him with something like pity. Then it falls to us to remember. Outside, the bells of St. Martin's tolled 8. Their chime filtered through the broken roof, mingling with the last tremors of candlelight until even the sound seemed to flicker and fade. Holmes reached down, picked up the fragment of mirror, and pocketed it without a word. As we stepped into the rain-washed street, the first streaks of dawn touched the clouds above the river, painting them the color of blood thinned with sorrow. It is a curious thing to witness the final act of a tragedy, not upon the stage, but within the heart of a living man. In all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, I had seen him dissect mysteries that would have broken another mind, but I had never seen him carry the weight of a soul he could not save. That night at the Lyceum had ended in smoke, silence, and the echo of a woman's last breath. And though the case was concluded by every outward measure, the look in his eyes told me that the story itself refused to die. 3 days passed before he spoke again of it. London, indifferent as ever, had resumed its heartbeat of carriages, markets, and gossip. The newspapers, with their usual appetite for spectacle, printed vague reports of a minor fire at the Lyceum Theatre and the sudden death of an anonymous woman believed to be a performer. They wrote of no conspiracies, no aristocratic scandals, no shadowed societies of masks and mirrors. The story, like the ashes of the theatre itself, was quietly swept away. Holmes read each article without expression, then folded the paper and cast it into the fire. "Watson," he said softly, "do you recall what she said in her last words? That the mirror breaks." I nodded. "Then consider this," he continued. "A mirror may shatter, but every fragment still reflects. Truth does not die. It merely changes its surface." He rose, crossing to the violin. It had not been touched since the night of the fire, and as he lifted it now, I half expected him to coax from it some melancholy dirge. But instead he set it down again, his hand lingering on the wood as though upon the shoulder of an old friend he no longer trusted. "Music, mirrors, masks. What are they but means of deception?" he murmured. "And yet they are also the only ways we know to approach beauty. Perhaps deception is not the enemy of truth, but its disguise." I said nothing. It was not the tone of argument, but of confession, and I had learned long ago that Holmes's rare moments of philosophy were not to be intruded upon. He paced to the window and stared out at the pale morning mist that blurred the rooftops of Marylebone. "Do you believe, Watson," he asked suddenly, "that evil can exist without intent? That a man might build a theatre for art and discover too late that he has built a tomb?" I met his gaze. If so, then Henry Vale is guilty only of vision gone astray. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, he was guilty of obedience, to Pennington, to the myth, to the applause. But she—" He trailed off, his voice lowering to a whisper. "She was guilty only of wanting to be free." He moved to his desk and opened a drawer. From within, he drew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "I sent a man to the ruins of the theatre," he said. "This was found in the debris beneath the stage." He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay the remains of the silver locket, blackened, warped by heat. But within its melted casing gleamed a single shard of mirror, unbroken. Beneath it was a slip of paper written in the same violet ink as the letters before. "Every truth requires an audience." Holmes stared at it for a long while. "An audience," he murmured. That was always the point. She knew that her death would not matter unless someone bore witness. And we did. He turned the shard in the light. For an instant, his reflection fractured into a dozen versions of himself, each one colder, more remote, more spectral than the next. Then he set it down, with quiet finality. "The Duchess of Death," he said, "will never again take the stage. But the world that created her still applauds. The case should have ended there, but fate rarely closes its curtains cleanly." That afternoon, a visitor arrived, a young man scarcely more than 20, pale with the ink-stained fingers of a clerk and eyes red from sleeplessness. He carried an envelope sealed in black wax. "For Mr. Holmes," he said, voice trembling. "From Lord Pennington." Holmes broke the seal. The letter within was short, written in Pennington's unmistakable hand. "Mr. Holmes, the world has already forgotten her. I find that I cannot. You were correct. I did not kill her with my hands, but I find my conscience less forgiving than the courts. By the time you read this, I shall have gone to the only stage large enough to contain my guilt, the Thames. You may think me cowardly, but I prefer to call it the final bow." The letter bore no signature, only a small imprint of a crown pressed into the wax. Holmes read it twice, then folded it and placed it in his pocket. He said nothing, but his hand trembled slightly as he struck a match for his pipe. The silence between us was thick, unyielding. Later that night, we stood together upon Westminster Bridge. The river rolled beneath us, swollen and dark. A police lantern bobbed in the distance where a small crowd had gathered. A body had been pulled from the water. The constable approached, hat in hand. "Gentlemen," he said gravely, "Lord Alistair Pennington. No sign of struggle." Holmes thanked him quietly, then stood staring at the water for a long moment. "The river keeps its secrets," he said. "Perhaps that is why men go to it when they tire of hearing their own lies." We walked back to Baker Street in silence. The fog thickened as the lamps began to dim, and the city seemed to retreat into itself, weary of drama. Inside our rooms, the fire still burned, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Holmes removed his coat, poured himself a measure of brandy, something he seldom did, and sat without speaking for several minutes. At last, he said, "Do you know what I find most haunting, Watson? Not that she died, nor that he followed her, but that they both sought the same release. The silence after the curtain falls." He turned to the violin, lifted it once more, and began to play, not the dissonant fragments he so often used to think, but a slow, sorrowful melody that filled the room with a kind of aching peace. It was a requiem, I think, though for whom I could not say, for the actress, for her maker, or for the detective who had seen too much of both illusion and truth. When he finished, the last note lingered like breath upon the air. He lowered the bow and said quietly, "Some cases, Watson, are not meant to be solved. They are meant to remind us what cannot be reasoned away." The clock struck midnight. Beyond the window, the fog swallowed the last of the city's light. Holmes sat motionless, eyes fixed upon the dying fire, its embers glowing the same shade of scarlet as the stage that had burned 3 nights before. He spoke once more, almost to himself. "The curtain has fallen, Watson, but I fear the applause may never end. There are nights in London when even the air seems unwilling to stir, when the city's endless murmur falls away and leaves behind only the faint crackle of the lamplight. In such moments, Baker Street itself feels as though it has drifted outside of time, a narrow island of silence surrounded by the slow tide of a sleeping world. It was on one such night, some weeks after the affair of the Lyceum, that I came to understand what the word haunting truly meant. For though the case was closed, though Lord Pennington's body had been claimed by the river and the theatre's ruins swept clean of all trace, Holmes had not returned to himself. He moved through our rooms like a man living in a house he no longer recognized, his steps measured, his gestures absent-minded, his voice, when it came at all, gentle but detached, as though he were speaking from the far side of a glass. His violin lay untouched upon the cabinet, and his chemical table stood in the same disarray it had on the morning after our last visit to the Lyceum. I urged him more than once to take a case, to travel, to do anything that might shake from him the shadow of that night, but he would only smile faintly and say, "Patience, Watson. Some wounds prefer silence to surgery." It was not idleness that consumed him, however. I would wake sometimes in the small hours to hear the faint rustle of papers, the strike of a match, the scrape of his chair upon the floor. When I entered, I would find him at his desk, the lamplight casting his profile into sharp relief, studying the burned remnants of that infernal ledger, as though its ashes still contained the secrets of life and death. On one such night I said, perhaps too sharply, "Holmes, you cannot resurrect the dead by reading their epitaphs." He looked up at me then, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep weariness, the kind that settles behind the mind rather than within it. "I do not seek to resurrect them," he said. "I seek to understand the stage upon which they fell. The city, Watson, our London, is a theatre, and we are all its unwilling actors. Some of us simply forget our lines less easily than others." He turned back to his papers, and I left him to the quiet company of the fog pressing against the window panes. The following morning brought a letter. It was delivered by hand, the envelope plain, the handwriting firm yet feminine. Holmes read it in silence, and then passed it to me. There were only a few lines. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the theatre will rise again. The Duchess has many faces, and London many stages, but I thank you for seeing one mask fall. A friend from the wings. The signature was indecipherable, a single looping initial that might have been an E, or something else entirely. Holmes smiled faintly. Do you see, Watson? Even ashes have an audience. I frowned. You think someone survived? That there may have been more involved than Vale or Pennington? Not think, he replied. No. My inquiries have revealed that another theatre, a smaller house in Covent Garden, has quietly been purchased under an assumed name. Its patronage matches Pennington's former associates, and its first scheduled production bears a most familiar title, The Duchess of Death. The revelation struck me like cold water. Good heavens, then all this, her death, the fire, even Pennington's suicide, was not enough. Not for those who profit from myth, Holmes said. A story such as this does not end. It renews itself in whispers and candlelight, feeding on the same audience that condemned it. He sighed. I could close the theatre again, expose them all, but what would I achieve? Another fire, another name, another mask. The city will not permit its illusions to die. For several days after that, he withdrew entirely from company. Mrs. Hudson, alarmed by his silence, begged me to intervene. I found him seated at the window late one evening, a book open on his lap, though he was not reading. The room was unlit save for the glow of the street lamp outside, which cast his reflection upon the glass. Two figures, side by side, one alive and one spectral. Without looking up, he said, Do you believe in ghosts, Watson? I hesitated. Only in the ghosts that memory breeds. He nodded slowly. Then we are haunted men, you and I. Haunted by what we have witnessed and by what we have failed to prevent. The clock ticked between us, filling the silence like the slow pulse of something unseen. At last he spoke again, more softly. There are moments, Watson, when I think of that stage as a mirror, not merely of them, but of myself. I, too, have made lives perform according to my design. I've used men's secrets as cues, their fears as dialogue. And when the curtain fell, I applauded my own cleverness. Tell me, what is the difference between the detective and the director, save the audience they choose to deceive? I protested, as I always did when he turned such blame inward, but he silenced me with a gesture. No, my friend, do not comfort me with reason. I have reason enough. What I lack is faith, that the pursuit of truth can be cleansed of vanity. He rose then, lit the fire, and stood before it, his silhouette tall and spare against the flames. Pennington drowned, seeking absolution. Vale burned, seeking recognition. She died, seeking freedom. And I, what do I seek, Watson? Perhaps only quiet. The weeks that followed passed uneventfully. Holmes refused new cases, though several came through the post. I busied myself with my practice, yet I could not shake the sense that something within him was ebbing away. Slowly, imperceptibly, as the tide draws back before a storm. One fog-drenched morning in February, I returned from a patient's house in Bloomsbury to find him, gone. Upon the mantel lay a single envelope addressed in his bold, angular hand. To Dr. John H. Watson, my friend. I opened it with trembling fingers. Watson, do not be alarmed. I am not dead, merely departed for a time. The air in London has grown heavy with illusion, and I must breathe elsewhere. There are cases still unsolved, but none so urgent as the one within myself. If you ever doubt the value of what we have done, remember this. Even in the theatre of lies, truth requires its chronicler. You have been mine. S.H. There was no date, no destination, no promise of return. For months afterward, I received no word. The newspapers, as they always did, filled the void with rumor. Holmes seen in Paris, in Constantinople, in Tibet. Each story bore the same flaw as those of the Duchess. They told what the audience wished to believe. I chose instead to believe in silence, and so Baker Street became a mausoleum of memory. The violin gathered dust, the pipe cooled, and the air grew still save for the faint ticking of the clock. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the fog drifts low and the lamplight flickers across the window, I imagine I hear a faint melody rising from the chair by the hearth, a few slow, mournful notes that fade before they form. Perhaps it is only the house settling, or my mind playing tricks upon the past. Or perhaps it is the sound of a man who understood that even when the curtain falls, the echo of the performance endures. Quiet, persistent, eternal. And in those moments I rise, light the fire, and whisper into the emptiness, "The stage is yours again, Holmes." Then I listen to the silence that follows. It is deep and endless, and not entirely lonely. For though the world forgets, I remember. And in remembering, the play goes on.